Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru. Welcome to our podcast. We are talking about the excellent book, The Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. We're going through it line by line. I'm here with almost the usual crowd. We got Chris and Priyank, but we also got a special guest, as promised last time. We got Nick on the call. Nick, how are you doing today?
Hello.
What time is it where you are?
It's 7:18 in the morning where I'm at.
Brutal, yeah. But
that's commitment.
But as a yogi, you are already awake and ready. That's very good.
That's how it's supposed to be, I guess.
Wait for Priyank to ask if you've done all your meditations.
Seeing as she's recently re-guesting, we won't give her any hospital pass questions.
Not yet. We'll come later. I'm sure we always manage to do one or two.
The disciplinarian, keeping us on our toes. Thank you, Priyank.
Yeah, somebody has to do it, right, Priyank? Otherwise,
it's the main guy. The spirit of the main guy compels me.
Exactly.
Yes, the spirit of the main guy.
Yeah.
All right. Should we get into it? So today we're still in chapter 4. It's episode 5 now. Guruji had just escaped to the Himalayas. He made it as far as Hardwar before he was caught by the police there. His brother took him afterwards to Varanasi to meet a sage, under quotes, and now they're going back home. And at home, there's a bit of a surprise for him because his father, Bhagavati, he felt that he needed to do something because his son, he's very spiritually inclined. And I think in his mind, he seems a bit without direction and just wants to go to the Himalayas. So he has to somehow maybe put his spiritual vigor into some kind of some tracks. And so he hired a Sanskrit tutor by the name of Kebalananda. And I want to ask that question in the group, actually. What do we think was the reason for Bhagavati to hire the Sanskrit tutor? Because we later figure out that it doesn't really turn out the way he wants it to. Yeah, Nick?
Well, this immediately reminds me of when I was a kid. I had a lot of free time because I'm a kid. And my mom was like, we should enroll you in some classes to divert all your energy. So this kind of gives me that vibe where like the parent knows about how like kids are. So they kind of put some like road, those, I don't know the proper word, but they kind of give you like a sense of like, hey, if you have all this energy, like you should check this out. And she found that I liked music. She bought me a synthesizer, like a really basic one, and she enrolled me in some classes. It was fun for like 2 weeks, but then I stopped going because it was disciplinary. So
didn't you get a Sanskrit? I thought she would have given you a Sanskrit tutor.
that would have been fun. That would have been really fun. But going back to the Sanskrit teacher, I feel like the Himalayas is usually known for where your yogis and aesthetics go. So I feel like he was just planting seeds like, oh, if he just shows up there, how is he going to keep up with it, right? So
yeah, we discussed last time about the two approaches that the two patriarchs in the family took. The first, the older brother, Ananta, took the somewhat conniving route of hiring a fake sage and paying him to say, no, Mukunda, you stay within the family, have a wife, and all your spiritual needs will be, achieved later. And then we have, as we said, the father Bhagavati, who does it in a more genuine way. And he obviously has to do something because Mukunda is very young, even though he's very capable of being a Bala Yogi. We know that, which is a child yogi, Mukunda. He could have just left home at any time and he still would have been a Yogananda. But he had to things that he needed to have in his locker room, shall we say. For example, Sri Yukteswar made him have a degree, and made him establish, not made him, inspired him to establish a school in Ranchi and things like that. So those kind of things needed to happen for him to become Paramahansa Yogananda, as opposed to just perhaps Swami Yogananda. So this is potentially why Mukunda's father did this. Tried to giving him some gentle boundaries. And I love the wording that Mukunda uses to describe these gentle boundaries. He says, "Father touchingly requested me to curb my roving feet." And then he says later, "He lovingly hatched a plot by arranging a saintly bundit." Swami Kebalananda. So really nice wording, but gets you to the kind of the essence of what Mukunda's father was trying to do for him.
Yeah. So I agree, and I feel like we kind of all agree that this was in reaction to Guruji running to the Himalayas. Bhagavati thought he had to do something for him, and like Priyank said, putting it in giving him some boundaries, but within the space. Then another question would be one that Priyank himself raised was this so we feel like this is supposed to move Mukunda back into kind of what people traditionally understand as being religious, and maybe stopping him from running away to the Himalayas in the future. But on the other hand, if you study scriptures, doesn't this at the end push you back to, if you are spiritually inclined and you study the scriptures, isn't this just emphasizing what you are looking for, Chris?
Yeah, it has that effect on Yogananda, but probably quite uniquely so because of who this individual was. And we know from this section of the chapter that Bhagavati was not aware of the grandeur, the spiritual grandeur that this soul kind of brought to the fore. So I think speculation-wise, Bhagavati, wasn't aware of just how profoundly advanced a teacher he was giving Yogananda, and he probably thought he might somewhat bore him to some extent and kind of contain, curb him his interest a little bit in it. That's just pure speculation, of course, but I do get that impression that there's a lot of sort of classes and things you can do out there that make it more work than play, but it turned out to be very much play for Yogananda because he was able to get all these fascinating stories and that fire was lit rather than sort of curtailed. So
do you think he may have actually have known Swami Kebalananda's true capability and his characteristic and his qualification of being actually a guru later on? He didn't take the renunciance vows at that point, but he must have been well known for his intellectual prowess.
I would have thought so, but then the way Guruji describes it is like that this happened in spite of what his father wanted, right? That he was actually this very spiritual man, but that wasn't Bhagavati's intention. I feel like that's what Yogananda is stating here. Maybe subconsciously. I mean, definitely that it was the divine will, but it feels like that this was not the main intention that Bhagavati had here.
yeah, and to me, it was quite surprising to hear that Bhagavati was not aware of who he was asking to be the teacher of Yogananda. But then we have a little bit of an inclination as to why. And again, I was quite surprised by this to some degree, that it says the peerless guru had possessed thousands of disciples. So I think that's the indication of, hey, no harm to Bhagavati. You can't know everybody that comes through the door of Lahiri Mahasaya, even though he is a devotee of Lahiri Mahasaya himself. Just like we don't know every single individual that comes into the London Centre, or is anywhere else around the world with as a devotee to Yogananda, Bhagavati. We can't presume that he's going to be aware of who this individual is just because they share the same guru.
Yeah, so at this point we can mention, right? So Guruji says this line, unknown to father. Swami Kebalananda was an exalted disciple of Lahiri Mahasaya. And this was basically exactly what Mukunda wanted. Maybe not what Bhagavati wanted, but he had suddenly this, he calls him later this saintly man, right? So he had like this saintly teacher who would come by his house weekly now, and they wouldn't really study the Bhagavad Gita much, but instead they would talk about God and meditate together.
Indeed. But when they did talk about the Sanskrit, and we Mikey touched this earlier, when you study Sanskrit, even if you're doing it just to study like grammar and etymology of words and poetry, the best examples of Sanskrit you would pick, are verses from, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, which has very poetic Sanskrit grammar and rhymes and things like that. So you'd have to study the script. You'd have to study the best of it, and the best of it is in the Holy Scriptures, and then hence you'd have to go into those spiritual modes, as it were. So if you're going to really recite Sanskrit, recite the mantras, right, then you'd become meditative, and hence then the chanting of the mantra or the Sanskrit that he's teaching then becomes a meditative space, and then they would obviously just close their eyes and potentially practice Kriya as you would.
So he did that. We'll hear a little bit later also where he also and how he learned about some of the scriptures from his guru. But let's get into the man a little bit. Guruji mentions his handsome face. I feel like he looks like a well-known Irish actor, but maybe it's just me, because mentioned it to the guys earlier and they only half-heartedly agreed.
I didn't know, Chris, have you done acting before? I didn't realize you were on TV.
Oh, there we go. Okay, this took a turn now. Yes, that's what I said. Christopher. Yes.
He's actually the actor you are referring to is maybe 5 miles, born 5 miles from my birthplace in Northern Ireland. So
because that's, everything in Northern Ireland is 5 miles away.
Yeah.
Why are you keeping everyone in suspense? You might as well say the actor in question.
Yeah, we want people to guess, to write in.
Let's just say he has a particular set of skills, right?
He would find you easily if you haven't participated.
He will find you.
Liam Neeson, people. Liam Neeson.
Yes.
Way to spoil the fun there, Frank.
I think people probably have figured out by now. Anyways, Priyank, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you found out about Kebalananda?
Yes, so Shastri Mahasaya, who people lovingly named him because he was a master of Shastra, should we say. And Shastra is obviously scripture. And there's a Swami Satyananda, who is Mukunda's childhood friend, and later on the head teacher of the Ranchi school, who wrote a beautiful biography about Shastri Mahasaya, which I read earlier this year, which was published in 1942, or around that sort of time. And he has some very beautiful, it has quite an interesting life story, shall we say. But his prowess in literary circles was because he was so, advanced in his interpretation and his explanation of scripture. So he was, for example, invited by people at universities and other scholars to provide opinions, and he'd probably be consulted about various scripture. And he was even he was not just Sanskrit, he was actually an expert in other other languages of a similar age. Like there's another language called Bali, which is a different script to Sanskrit and a different Indo-European language. And some of the scriptures that we have in India are in the Bali script. So then he was also an expert in that script. So he was very, very intellectually capable, shall we say. And he met he was a contemporary of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa. So he in the book he describes it describes how much he influenced him, which was quite nice. And he was also had the company of Trailanga Swami as well, which he's discussed in the book as well later in the autobiography, shall we say? So yeah, it's a good book. I'll put a link to that biography that Swami Satyananda has written. But he also got married. Would you believe? So this is obviously before he took his monastic vows. Nick, do you want to read the item D that I've got on the comments at the bottom?
Just to confirm, you said item D?
Yes.
Okay, so 1 second. Shri Shri Thakur, Shri Shri Shamcharan Lahiri Mahasaya, determining the appropriate time, eventually advised him to become a householder. His mother's wish was fulfilled at a late age. Shastri Mahasaya was married, but it was never possible for him to quite act as a householder in domestic life. And enraptured by spiritual inspiration, it seemed that the conducting domestic living in a non-attached, non-desirous, easy and simple manner, as well as with the vow of poverty. I feel like I'm missing a line. Never mind, I'm on the same line. With the vow of poverty was the special way of his life. In financial stress, facing difficulties in carrying out requested tasks, the death of a child, and numerous types of unfortunate occurrences, not for a single day was he seen to have depressed or have turned away from his duties. Observing his behavior, it seemed as if he had given all responsibility of the householder life to the Lord and was at complete peace. The unthinkable ways for his daughter and other needs of the unthinkable ways we saw by which the challenges such as wedding arrangements for his daughter and the other needs of domestic life were resolved by such events. Our belief of that he had relinquished all to the Lord seemed to be greatly and strongly confirmed.
Yeah,
I needed to hear that.
So he had quite a challenging life, but he vowed even before marriage to devote his life to God and to live essentially a life of very minimal material needs, and hence all those difficulties were piled upon him, shall we say. So he's and then later on became a monastic, and Swami Kebalananda, as it's in the footnote later.
So Guruji calls him Kebalananda throughout the book, kind of, even though at the point where he gave him Sanskrit classes, he wasn't part of the Swami order yet. But he mentions that there's the great Mahashaya confusion. There's too many Mahashayas, so he doesn't want to add. He doesn't want to add to that. His family name was Ashutosh Chatterjee, and Kebalananda is the title he got once he joined the Swami order, and we can just go with that. He has a lot of people call him Shastri Mahashaya at this point, and which means that he's I guess Shastras is like how you say scriptures, I guess. So that means he's a man of the scriptures, in my opinion. Priyank?
Yes, he is. I love how Mukunda also describes him, like what his firstly his appearance. He describes it as if like you really want to be in this guy's presence. Luxurious curls fanned my tutor's handsome face. His dark eyes were guileless, with the transparency of a child's. All the movements of his slight body were marked with a restful deliberation. What a beautiful way to describe a yogi such as Shastri Mahasaya. That restful deliberation got me thinking, though. Do you guys, are your movements marked by restful deliberations, or are they rushed? Is that also linked to like your resting heart rates? Athletes' heart rates are usually like really low resting heart rates. Perhaps they also have a very restful, restful movements. I don't know, Chris.
No, Priyank, you're a fan of chess, and so am I. So I see this in chess. So what you'll notice, the grandmasters, the top level players, they move pieces with such grace, and there's such beauty to it. And it's one thing if you watch that Netflix documentary series to go off here. The oh gosh, the lady it's just slipped my mind. Anyway, there's a chess Netflix series.
You mean the Queen's Gambit?
Queen's Gambit, thank you. The one critic that many of the grandmasters had of it was that she didn't know how to move the pieces gracefully enough, which I thought was really interesting because they've almost meditated on chess so much, and they're at one with the pieces, so their movements are just fluid and almost motionless. You're like, wow, like how they move so seamlessly. So whenever I think about what Prem just said, this flashed into my mind. So you can see it in every aspect of what people do. I don't think I'm there yet, though. I move like clunky, drop the pieces. Yeah, one day.
I'd like to add a follow-up question to that, Chris. Do you think they just practice how to move the pieces rather than just? I mean, it's one thing being good at chess, but if you play on camera, you need to be really good at moving pieces, right? You need to.
It's a bit more than that actually, because there's this thing in chess called touch move. Chris, this isn't such a thing when you're playing online electronically these days, but when you have physical pieces in your in front of you, if you don't, sometimes you're moving pieces in between pieces, and if you brush a piece, the rule is you have to move it there, or you have to take that piece. So if you don't do it with a restful deliberation, if you don't do it very carefully and elegantly, then you will effectively be forced into a move that you didn't want to do because you're clumsy with how you're moving your pieces and how you're moving your hands or how you're sliding the piece across the board. So people do it very elegantly and carefully, shall we say. Nick?
I wanted to add, like, right, based when I want to jump into an observation I've made about graceful movement. I feel like it's so crucial because it's like when you're out and about and then you see somebody waving, but you think it's you, but it's not you, so you try to wave back. So it kind of reminds me of that, where like we have the presence of a yogi has to be, not just a yogi, just anybody living through life has to be so within our body that, like, if we make the wrong move, we may end up embarrassing ourselves, or we may end up saying or taking the wrong turn if we're not in our bodies. So I don't know how I got there, but I feel like a touch move is something we all have made in our waking lives when we're not mindful. So just throwing that out there.
Chris, you can go before I go.
I'll just make one final comment. There's a lady who I was very fond of. She passed recently, a devotee at the SRF London Centre. And I was talking to her one day, and she told me a story very, very humbly. She said she was approached in a shop one day by a complete stranger who came up to her and said, "Hey, you move with such grace. I want to learn, why this is, and a little bit more about this." And she put it down to the practice that we do in meditation in Kriya Yoga, and how powerful that is, and that sort of exuded through her, and she was quite an adept. So that was a nice story that I heard told to me, that a stranger just approached her out of nowhere and said, "Hey, you move with such grace." So kudos to her.
I know exactly who you're talking about, Chris, and it's a good point because you know when you're around people that move gracefully or with a restful deliberation, you kind of know it, and people that aren't used to it think, oh, they're just slow, they're just being slow and lazy. But people that are of a that meditation space, then you can see it, right? And it's so nice to be in that presence, and it's so nice to serve with them as well, right? It kind of has that calming effect on whatever you're doing or whatever state of mind yours is. And this is why going into SRF Center is just such a beautiful experience, even before you start meditating, because everyone from like the ushers to the reader to the chanter, everyone's in this kind of state, speaking very softly and standing very gently, and the posture is very gentle. It's all such good training. But Chris, you probably, I don't know if you know, but that devotee that you're talking about was an artist. So in art, moving a hand, you have to do it very gracefully, you have to do it very restfully, and that's true with all the arts, right? The dancing and acting, for example, you have to be very careful with your body, and so it is kind of implies the importance of the arts in the spiritual life, really. You could say the arts, therefore, are actually more important than maths or science in that respect. And I've got a very beautiful picture from that said artist. This is called Divine Mother, and I've made it into a kind of an altar. This is in the background of my computer, behind my computer when we're doing our podcasts, which is quite nice.
Yeah, she was great. She had lots of great art. And I'll just end on this from my side. I do ceramics, like pottery and things like this, and what I notice is it's meditative there. It is like a meditative practice almost. It's in a very peaceful environment, but the teacher is, just as we're describing, very purposeful with his speech and movement and things like this. So you can see it all over when you know what to look for. But yeah, back to the book. I suppose it's not a big way, but
That's a good tangent. Guruji talks often about how no matter what happens, we should never allow any circumstance to rob us of our peace. And I guess this is true in any circumstance. When you're serving Guruji or when you're doing anything else in life, you just send out peace, you will at some point get peace back. And speaking of peace, let's continue, because Shastri Mahasaya, not only is he a disciple of Lahiri Mahasaya, but he's full of stories about being in Lahiri Mahasaya's presence, which Mukunda finds fascinating. His parents, they are also disciples of Lahiri Mahasaya, but they, I think, almost all the time lived in a different city, right? They never really were able to spend weeks on end at Lahiri Mahasaya's ashram. Kebalananda, on the other hand, he was doing that. He was so he talks about it so beautifully. He says his disciples garlanded him in a semicircle. His eyes sparkled and danced with the joy of the divine. They were ever half closed, peering through the inner telescopic orb into a sphere of eternal bliss. So you sit there and are in his presence, and I would say a part of you is soaking in this divine presence of the divine master. He even says that just being in the presence of him continuously changed his being and his whole life. So this is how powerful it is. In India, I'll say that later. Priyank?
No, carry on.
I was just gonna say in India they call that darshan, right? When you are in the present, but I think by that you often just mean getting a glimpse of a holy person, but spending a portion of your life in the presence of a holy person, this continuous darshan has a profound effect on one's life.
Yeah, It does. And I love that the little thing that he put about, sometimes words wouldn't be exchanged for days, but people would still be gathered. And this is such a stark contradiction to how we see silence and no words being spoken amongst two lovers or two friends or between teacher and disciple. If no words are spoken, then generally the first thought is, oh, they've become a bit distant. They can't really spend time with each other. And this experience that Swami Kebalananda is describing here knocks that on its head. It's a completely 180 thing, right? It's actually the most profound connection you can have with someone when it's without needing words.
The same lady that I was referring to earlier, who moved with grace, told me one time that Yogananda had said that you don't have to necessarily go out there in a mission to try to change the world just by doing your practice and going about your daily life. You're going to impact people beyond what you can see. So I think this is the same principle that just by being in another's presence, you'll be able to rub off on the other person energetically, or just by what Priyank said, going to the centers and observing how people are, you pick up these behaviors and traits and things like this. But yeah, it's such an honor, isn't it? Like, imagine if you could just, as it's said here, do a pilgrimage like every night to Lahiri Mahasaya's house, where he's just sitting there with open doors. Like you can just go in and he's always there. So cool, isn't it? I would love to be able to do that. Yeah, it's such an honor that he has.
It's a huge blessing, and he describes it that he just at the glance of his master, he gets filled with this peace. And I wonder if you guys have ever felt this. You are in the presence of a spiritual person and you feel peace, or you are meditating in a certain group and suddenly it feels like easier to go into a deep state than in other times, or you are in a place that is hallowed with the presence of a certain saint and you feel like it draws you within. Those things matter. I don't think they are necessary to become a yogi, but I think those things exist. Nick?
They absolutely exist. I have to say, I visited Sagrada Familia in
Barcelona.
I think
Barcelona,
Barcelona. It's in around March, and the moment I looked at the building, I was like, I was sobbing, and as I got closer, I was sobbing even more. So it was really funny. So I had to, of course, they make you go through security and stuff. So I held it in at that time. But then as like after that, I was just like looking at this marvel, and I don't know, I feel like Gaudi has to be a saint. I just, the way, the detail, the presence of him was so alive there. It was like, you don't have to be called a saint, or you don't have to be called a yogi. You just have to just be in this unspeakable vibration, and people will feel it. That's a language. Silence is a language of its own, and it speaks in so many forms. Like, I've met so many people who are not on the path. I'm just like, I drool over how like how radiant they are by just being in the presence. It's a universal language, actually. You don't have to be affiliated with any practice to, they might have their own practice to cultivate it, who knows? But it's a language of its own. I don't even know how to describe how I felt when I went to the Sagrada Familia. It was just otherworldly. So it does exist.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good example. I feel that that's definitely true what you said, Nick, that some people, they just have an aura around them. Effortlessly, they can just transport you into another state. and not all of them are spiritual people, but there must be something to them, that either they first made a spiritual effort in another life, or there must be some kind of explanation like that. And yet Sagrada Familia is funny, because I remember seeing it for the first time, and I was like, this building looks so strange. Because it's a lot of it has no plaster on it yet, and it has those rectangular holes everywhere. And then when I went inside, there's like a model of how it is supposed to look when it's done, and it's so beautiful. It looks like it looks so happy. It looks colorful. It is so. I guess, yeah, I don't want to say that, but maybe it's just a model for how we are molding our own life. In the beginning, it doesn't look right, but we are chipping away on it and turning it into this beautiful thing. And yeah, Gaudi is definitely an interesting person. I'll leave it at that.
He definitely would have had a restful determination about him when placing those minuscule tiles up in that plaster, you know, for his mosaics, and it's just, yeah, it's absolutely stunning. I fully appreciate what Nick and Mike you've just said.
One more thing that I like about Gaudi is that he left the city of Barcelona with 100 years of spiritual work, kind of, right? So he put that church at I think it's definitely #1 or up there with the tourist attractions in Spain, and he and it's a work in progress. So constantly it needs more work, and he put that there. And when you are the city of Barcelona, what are you gonna do? You have to finish it. So.
An engineer's nightmare.
Yeah, the good old 80-20 rule. All right. So back to Lahiri Mahasaya. So he was receiving, like Chris said earlier, he had this open door policy, and people would sit in a semicircle around him. Like Priyank said, they would sometimes not speak for days, but they would go into those deep states, and everyone was in deep states, and I suppose Priyank.
Yeah, the semicircle garland. You know, initially when I thought about it, I thought it was, you know, often we in India we garland our saints with, you know, a row of flowers and put it around their neck, and I thought, oh, this is what they must be talking about. But here he's actually saying there was kind of like around him in a semicircle, like a garland, which is such a beautiful image, isn't it, of devotees sitting at the master's feet. And there's a very nice painting that someone's done of the masters in the Himalayas, and it's really nice because it's like they're around a fire, and the fire is like crackling, and all of our gurus and Anandamayi Ma all around there, and it's such a nice picture. And whenever we post that picture, it always does super well because of that. But I love the descriptions here. We'll go to that in a minute, Chris.
I was just about to talk about the descriptions, actually.
In sync.
Yeah. What I think is really kind of fun here to think about is we have a image of Lahiri Mahasaya, and his eyes are half closed in it. I always thought, oh, that's probably a pose for that particular photo or that image that we have. Like it's more of a pose to symbolize the reality of where he is. But here it says that his eyes, you know, sparkled and danced with joy of the divine. But it goes on to say they were ever half closed. And to me, that kind of knocked me back. Like, wow, like he's just always in that state. Like he's just always eyes half closed. You know, this is his state permanently. It must have been such a, as he describes here, a powerful experience to be in that space when somebody is just constantly in that state of being. It's incredible.
And
Yeah.
now imagine now imagine you're in this environment and you add scripture to it. So now you want to have scripture interpreted. You read scripture at home, you go to Lahiri Mahasaya and ask him, could you help me understand what it says in this scripture? And he, I would say, has a very, I think, especially at the time, a very unique approach of explaining scripture to some of his students. So there's this scene that Kebalananda describes, and he says there's a student that asks for the meaning of a certain probably stanza in the scripture. And then I learned a new word again, taciturn, which means someone who speaks little. So the guru was like, instead of like starting like a long-winded explanation about this, I will guide your thoughts to get to the right point. Isn't that fantastic? You sit there in meditation and meditate, I'll guide your thoughts where it is. Because it is something that Guruji often describes, that you cannot really explain the truth, you have to experience it. Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, also on a similar point, I wondered if you guys thought the same, that it says here, occasionally the Lahiri Mahasaya's gaze would focus on a student in need of help. And I thought to myself, is that more of a mental thing, like, or is the student really kind of putting their hand up and saying verbally, hey, I need some help with X? Like, the way I envisaged it is that he simply knew that, there's going to be a student there. As Sri Yukteswar and Yogananda, we know there that Yogananda's thoughts might be array, and Sri Yukteswar would know immediately and say, hey, focus, or keep doing the meditation. In this similar sort of way, that Lahiri Mahasaya intuitively knew what was going on with each and every student, and he was able just to lay his eyes on them. An avalanche of light would pour through his healing words. Like, it's just, it's an incredible scene.
How can we put this to practice and let Guruji or Lahiri Mahasaya guide our own thoughts in our daily lives? Pretty tough question. Mike?
Oh no, Chris, you had your hands up.
I think it's kind of an easy one. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too naive here.
Okay.
You think of them near. You think of them as near to you, as there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's been said quite explicitly, like by Lahiri Mahasaya himself. Like, those who think of me near, I shall be there. Some paraphrasing.
Shall we put it to test? I'll give you some obscure scripture.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, hold on.
You then think of that famous line, to those who think me near, I'll be nearer to the dear, dearer to the dear, or something like that. Yeah,
you're mixing two together.
Dearer than the deer. Yes. So Chris, let's do it. I'll give you some, obscure scripture. Yeah, you ready?
Wait, let me get my Google.
Okay.
No, just
wow.
kidding.
Yeah, let's ask ChatGPT. Yeah, but I was just gonna say, oh yeah, Chris, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
Sorry, just to dwell on that point a little bit more. I do, maybe taking it away from your question, think that I've experienced it many times when I do sit in meditation and my mind's running away with itself, and the thing that really helps me get back to a point of meditation is envisage Yogananda. Like, just go put my focus on the Guru, and then all the problems that I think I'm going to try to solve mentally or do whatever with just melt, they vanish. So it's a pretty easy practice, in the sense that just go back to the basics.
I would have said prayer, I guess, but it does the same thing. I think when you pray, then you feel the Guru near, and that's what I do all the time, because I oftentimes see myself having to make decisions, and I always want Guruji to help me put my thoughts in the right direction and guide me there.
And I suppose the importance of the right thought, and which is why we got to read more and more of Yogananda's writing, because we have to tune in with him, and he often tells us, tune in to my thoughts, and we can say that prayer, isn't it? Thy will be done, not mine. Thou art the doer, not I. And if we get in more and more into that space, then we'll have this blessing, I suppose, of Guruji guiding our thoughts.
I wanted to just chime on and share that, like, when I was, I feel like I still am a fresh Kriya bun, but when I was like an extremely like fresh off the ceremony Kriya bun, I had this WWGD, which is what would Guruji do? And I was like, I keep this sentence, like it'll help me connect with him in a way. I don't know. I feel like even you just wanting to connect with him puts you in the state of receiving him, because like when you think him near, he'll be there, right? So it's I feel like personalizing your experiences with your own personality in life is so helpful, especially when you don't know what to do. Like, when you're a student, like for me, which I've been for a good time, it's if I don't get a question, I was like, okay, Guruji's gonna answer that question for me. I'm just gonna surrender. I feel like also surrendering is so huge. We can think to want him near, but if we don't surrender to that thought, we're not going to receive him. We can cry near him, but if we don't receive him, we're never going to get it. So it goes both ways too.
That's right. We have to give him time to answer. Yeah. Priyank found something interesting about an American Shastri Mahasaya, shall we say, who what do you find about that, Priyank?
No. That's you're talking about the link to the voluminous commentaries. Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about Emerson.
Emerson. Oh yes, Emerson.
Yes.
He is pretty cool. We talked about him in the last episode, but reading more of his writings, I kind of feel that his writing is very similar to Guruji's writing, especially not just the style. Obviously, some content he's taken. He's very inspired by Eastern thought, shall we say, and we know that from his biographers and what books he's recommended people and stuff like that. So he's a pretty cool guy. But I wonder how much Guruji actually, because he was around before Guruji. He was a prolific writer and very famous, even before Guruji came to America. So I wonder how much Guruji himself was inspired. He must have been, for him to mention Emerson as he has, and he's quoted his poem. In the previous episode, we quoted the poem, the Brahma poem. So he must have been influenced by him, because it's beautifully narrated.
Absolutely. I think Guruji, when he came to America, he really accepted the American culture, and he was looking for saintly people. I mean, we will later see the chapter he wrote on Luther Burbank. But he also, like you said, Priyank, he must have read Emerson a lot, and he mentions him often in his writings and quotes him, and beautiful poem as well. Yeah. So there's one more key thought that Kebalananda spoke about when he was at Lahiri Mahasaya's, and that was, like Chris said, there were sometimes disciples coming to him with problems, and to a self-realization fellowship or YSS devotee, a very familiar answer came often. It was like, practice Kriya Yoga. That is going to solve all your problems. And especially when we hear talks about monastics that have known Guruji, they said that often, that they came to Yogananda with all kinds of problems all the time. And then he would often give the answer, you need to meditate more, which is probably not what the ego wants to hear or what you want to hear at this point. But also it's the truth. And Guruji mentions this in many places, that we have to do our best in life. But the one thing that is pushing us forward is practicing pranayama, right? And that will get us an inch at a time in the right direction. And at some point we will have reached that goal. And this is the same sentiment that the disciples of Lahiri Mahasaya got when they were in his presence.
Really
All right.
potent, very potently put the words there, aren't they? Here, it's like affirmations for us in terms of how how devoutly we should do our practices. You know, how much Kriya Yoga can be the solution for everything, all the problems for our lives. Yeah, Nick.
I just wanted to add the moment Mike said, "Oh, the pranayam, we must practice pranayam." That one of the songs came in using the sword of pranayam, and that snapped something, because when we use swords, we cannot be clunky with the sword. We have to move the sword with the grace. I see the connection. I was like, oh my God, this makes a lot. Everything's so connected, because I've never seen like samurais, they move like the wind, you know, when they move their swords around. That's how pranayam grounds us into our life. It makes us move like the wind.
Opal flame, if thou wilt be opal flame.
Yes,
I think
that
that's
is
the
opal flame. Yeah,
chant. Yeah, really, really powerful chant.
one of my favorites.
Yeah. And another chant says that pranayam is beloved God and it's the wishing tree. So yeah, I think yeah, Chris.
One thing I did just want to say, we probably mentioned it a dozen times, but it's worth mentioning it again. And to your point, Mike, when you said the ego might want a different answer than, hey, you know, meditate more deeply, do your Kriya practices. You want to kind of understand what's going on in a little bit more theory or something, you know, whatever the ego wants. You're getting the help by the guru in the meditation. So we have the breakdown of the meditation in 25% is your effort, 25% is the guru's, 50% is God's. So, you know, you might go there and say, hey, Guru, please, you know, solve my problems, you know, do something, give me a blessing. But actually you're getting that in meditation. You're getting that hands-on help, you know, from the guru in the meditation. So, you know, when it's in one sense, like, hey, you need to go away and do the work, you're not doing it alone. So we know this by what Yogananda has told us before. So you do get that help always from the guru when you go and do the work in meditation.
Would you guys say we have covered this section, or is there something we want to add? Priyank?
A few things that I'd like to add, if you'll allow me.
Absolutely.
But mostly talking about the beauty of some of the lines here. But before we do that, Chris, do you want to mention something?
So, yeah, one of the things that I took away from this section of the book was the idea of scripture and the idea of meditation, and the impacts it can have. And we can see referenced in this section and others about people maybe knowing scripture and being able to espouse scripture, not really, you know, embodying scripture as Lahiri Mahasaya and others have done. Sri Yukteswar, he taught Yogananda to do. But we know here that Kriya Yoga is the thing that the masters point to really excel. And it's said here, I myself consider the most effective device of salvation through self-effort ever to be evolved in man's search for the infinite. You know, it's Kriya that he states. And that's, to me, just, it anchors it focuses my effort, let's say. If you're ever going to be out there searching, and maybe, you know, if anybody's listening to this is in that mode where you're kind of searching for the answer, searching for teachers or gurus, you know, for me, it maybe put the brakes on, stop the search. You've got some sort of idea here to look into, that Kriya is the most effective way to get to God. And Yogananda talks about it as the airplane mode to God, right? And I had a question for you guys, because I don't have the answers here. I'm hoping that you guys do. Why is Kriya the most effective device for salvation through self-effort? Why not something else?
What a profound question. Nirikshi, I believe you had some really good insights into that. No.
Oh my gosh, the first thought that comes up to me was, oh, it's just because it is, it's something that's, but I feel like I should expound on that, because the word because it allows you to just be. You don't need any external tools. All the tools are within you to practice it, right? I mean, except for your armrest, but that's the only exception I'm willing to make there. But it's so universal. You don't even have to, like, it's really funny. Kriya has been long for so long. You don't even have to know Kriya itself to practice it. It's a way of being. And there's so many people, not so many, I would say I've met a handful of people who are Kriya yogis without even knowing it. It's like, they're like, oh, I just sit and watch my breath. I was like, wait, do you even breathe? I don't hear you breathe. Like, and they're like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, you don't know? So no, but Kriya Yoga, honestly, it actually soothes your ego and your spirit, because there's the scripture part of it, and there's also like the practicals, so it's like a nice blend it's a nice play on duality, I'd say, because some parts of yoga could be just physical or just based on thought, so this is like a nice mix.
I have no answer.
Can we not let Swami Kebalananda's answer? Is that not good enough in this
So if I was
section?
a rookie, which I do consider myself to be, as I said before, if I was somebody maybe looking for what practice to follow, there's many different types of yoga out there. And why Kriya? Why is this the one? Why is it powerful? Because it is, it's like you've got a jetpack strapped to your back, and you're just, strap yourself in and keep your head down to the work. But why is it Kriya? I just had that question. Obviously, we can't talk about the actual techniques and things like that. But
so if you practice it, then you'll see its efficacy compared to other practices. For example, I tried many different techniques of meditation before settling on Kriya as my staple. And it is the most effective. There is nothing, you won't find a more, it's in the scripture, this is the most effective. Then you can try it, and as Swami, Lahiri Mahasaya said in this section of the book, he said, he used to undergo presently the state of the consciousness that's referred to in the scripture, and then manifest it. And we've given, when you have Kriya, you can also try that yourself, and you do, and I do, and then you'll see that it's true. But I love Swami Kebalananda, as I said, answer this in this section. He says, I myself consider Kriya the most effective device of salvation through self-effort, ever to be evolved in man's search for the infinite. Through its use, the omnipotent God, hidden in all men, became visibly incarnated in the flesh of Lahiri Mahasaya and of the number of his disciples. So this is who you can become, a Lahiri Mahasaya, essentially, using this yogic key, so beautifully written, expounded by Swami Kebalananda or Shastri Mahasaya.
Yeah, and it is mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita. It's worth saying, it's noted there as the practice really to do. So the royal science, isn't it?
Swap my ingoing breath for my outgoing breath, and my outgoing breath for my ingoing breath, something along those lines.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, it's profound, isn't it? And it's
Are you sold,
the
Chris? I don't know if that was
hey,
sufficient for you.
I'm sold. I'm sold. The initiation, Kriya initiation for me is happening in 2 weeks' time, so I'm super super excited.
Oh, right. So Niriksha, if our answers weren't good enough, he would have probably written to cancel his
On the
initiation.
everyone on the fence, yeah.
Not
No,
convinced.
And then they'll ask
it's
why, and then you can reference Priyanka Niriksha's responses did not inspire me. In fact, they
exactly. Yeah.
filled me with doubt and anxiety.
No, I think your answer to be both of your answers, great. And I was talking to one of the brothers recently, and he was telling me a story about how at the beginning of his journey he was praying to Yogananda to say, "Hey, I need just one example of the reality of this practice, and I need to see it. Just my ego needs to see some sort of truth in this, just one." And he said that he was visiting another monk at the time. This is 30-40 years ago, and he went to the feet of the monk, and he just almost kind of fell infinitely forward. He kind of went through his his pineal gland, and he just said that after that he didn't ask for anything else, because he had this great experience that he didn't need to get anything else affirmed, and he didn't need to go after anything else. And I think it's just a similar sort of thing, like experience teaches you more than any kind of scripture, right? Just to go back to it, like you do the practice, you get the experience. I've had that to a small degree, with the technique and the techniques that are taught through the lessons. So yeah, experience trumps all. So good answers, guys. So 10 out of 10.
I love how, compared to other paths, here it is more like there is this technique, you try it out. If it works for you, great. And if it doesn't work for you, then you can make your decision based on that. And I guess that's for me also the only testimony. I know my life without Kriya Yoga, and I know my life with Kriya Yoga. There's no comparison. So I feel like that's kind of why people who do it in most cases.
Niriksha?
Also, I do remember, I think when there's always like a disclaimer for the newcomers in the path, like, hey, question everything. And that itself is huge. Like, which other path tells you to test it? If you sit back and really think about it. Because, I mean, like, there's this quote that says, a bird's not afraid of a branch breaking because it's sure of its wings. I feel like that's what this path is. It's so sure in itself that, like, it's willing to be taken, it's willing to receive any form of criticism based on how strong it is, I believe. So that itself is huge, if you think about it.
Yeah, he never, Lahiri Mahasaya in this section of the chapter even says, he never said to, practice bookish belief of various things. He used to emphasize the path and the practice of the techniques as opposed to the theory and imagining, how great life could be. But the words in this section of the book are just absolutely phenomenal. I want to highlight some of my favorites because the red marker has certainly come out. The red marker is Nick, my favorite sections or quotes in the autobiography, which inspire me and which I can refer back to. And here, when referring to Lahiri Mahasaya, he says, Yogananda describes, or Swami Kebalananda describes, his eyes sparkled and danced with the joy of the divine. They were ever half closed, peering through the inner telescopic orb into a sphere of eternal bliss. That's pretty amazing. What does it mean, though, that if someone's eyes can dance with the joy of the divine? Sparkling eyes, we've kind of talked about in the past, when people have that glint of spiritual ardor or spiritual elements. You can see it sometimes, but the dancing, I've never heard that explanation or description. Mike?
I imagine people say that the eyes are the window into the soul, right? And so instead of seeing a static image, the whole thing becomes animated, and you see this kind of glimpse of this divine soul that is in front of you, even without actually not seeing his physical body. You see his physical body, but it becomes magnified in your vision just because there's this perfect man in cosmic consciousness in front of you.
They were. He said his eyes were half closed, and so he's. I think I've seen some people meditate in that way, and their eyes just slightly like move a little bit, like when they're focused upwards. So maybe that's what he's describing here, describing like the lights and the marvels that potentially some people see when their eyes are half closed. Chris?
I'm picturing electricity, and the electricity that the life energy, as you said, it comes into the body, it sparks and that flickers, and it's almost like a flame. This life that's there. And I'm just picturing that whenever I see it. So yeah, it's nice to break it down as to what exactly is meant, but I think intuitively we all know. When you know when you see it.
Oh, if only. The other thing that I remember when, as I said, mentioned previously, I used to do some other meditation practices. One of them was Buddhism, and I practiced some of their techniques. One of the things that they said was they just made us meditate once, and then they said, "How was that? How did you feel?" And everyone described how they felt. It was nice, peaceful, all that good stuff. And then they said, "All right, just now this time meditate. Do the exact same thing you did last time, but with a very 5% smile." So just raise a smile by 5% and do the same meditation again. And then we all did that. And everyone felt that it was just that 5% smile expression manifested into how joyful and how loving, how beautiful the meditation was. And there was a stark distinction between the previous meditation where your eyes were just focused up and you're just trying to meditate on the breath, etc. And the second time where the whole energy was around joy because you were smiling slightly. So I thought that was quite profound. It was quite nice. The other thing that he says here is occasionally his eyes would focus on a student in need of help, and then healing words poured then like an avalanche of light. Just what words? Avalanche of light. Again, if only I'd love to be in the sacred presence of that avalanche of light, but alas, we have to work for it within as opposed to without in the blessed feet of the great master. And he describes being in that blessed state or at the feet of the master, saying, an indescribable peace blossomed within me at the master's glance. I was permeated with his fragrance as though from a lotus of infinity. Lotuses are, very beautiful, and they're used in Indian art and in temples, but rarely do you see them described or used in everyday language in terms of describing a saint or a holy one in such beautiful prose here. I was permeated with his fragrance as though from a lotus of infinity. It's just, what amazing words. Like you could literally make little paragrams from these little gems, couldn't you? And this is the third time we've described Lahiri Mahasaya in this in a slightly nuanced way. The first couple of times where we described what did he say? Lahiri Mahasaya, the way that he was described by his parents earlier on in the book, in the first chapter. But Swami Kebalananda now just how's it go? And he says the master was a living temple of God, whose secret doors were open to all disciples through devotion, which is again very beautiful. Chris?
I was going to say just this. We've mentioned before that we haven't maybe recognized how much Lahiri Mahasaya featured it in the early part of the book. We kind of have this idea, yeah, you know, there's a chapter and there's a lot of content focusing on him later on, but he's everywhere. He's always mentioned, and when he is mentioned, you know, the first bit that says here in this part is the peerless guru. I thought that was such a great devotional way of talking about him as well. So you're quite right, Priyank. The devotion and the love that Yogananda is giving Lahiri Mahasaya is just permeated throughout the book in ways that are beautiful.
I also thought it was a bit of a technique here that's described, because it says the master was a living temple of God, whose secret doors were open to all disciples through devotion. Previously, we've heard the description, you know, divinity was fully manifested in Lahiri Mahasaya. But here we're described a door of how we can get into it. It says the secret doors were open to all disciples through devotion. And, you know, in our practices, we're taught to Kriya plus devotion, don't they? And we know that, for example, Yogananda's mother, Gyana Prabhu Ghosh, she was principally a devotee, wasn't she? That was her principal mode of worship, or sadhana, her spiritual practice. So really good insight there into how we can become closer to Lahiri Mahasaya. Mike?
And imagine you have the good karma to be present at this time when Lahiri Mahasaya is alive. And how did they say it in the movie? He was like making this spiritual renaissance happen in Varanasi, right? Where he brings back Kriya Yoga after it was lost in the dark ages for the first time to the masses. And you are like one of the first ones that gets to see the master and be in his presence and pay devotion to him in person.
Absolutely. And later in this section, it says through, talking about Kriya, through its use, the omnipotent God hidden in all men became visibly incarnated in the flesh of Lahiri Mahasaya and a number of his disciples. Really, again, beautiful way of describing the gurus. And talking about the life of Lahiri Mahasaya, he describes here that voluminous commentaries about the master have been written based on like the things that he's said. So he hasn't actually written anything himself, but lots of devotees have written commentaries and have been translated into English for us. And I'll put a link to some of them in the description, and of which there's a lot. But don't get lost in it, because you could get lost in it. That's everything from me.
Right. So one thing that we still have left to do is what's going to happen in the next episode, Priyank?
Oh yes, next episode. We've got more of Lahiri Mahasaya, and specifically he talks about a profound miracle that Lahiri Mahasaya performs, and we have some references to the beloved deity Ram Bhagwan, and we're going to talk about that and how karma and good fortune fit into that, humility as well. And then also there's a lovely there's some sections of the Bhagavad Gita and Arnold's translation of the Gita, so we'll talk about that as well. So, and then that will end the quite heavy chapter we've had. Surprisingly heavy. It was started off light and then became heavier.
Yes, that sounds wonderful. And so for this time, though, I want to thank our listeners and watchers on YouTube for joining, and you three, and Jai Guru, everybody.
Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.